Okay. Hello there. My name is Enrique Mato. This is my final. I'm going to be talking about chapter 12 to 16. I'm going to give a brief summary on each chapter, things I found interesting, quotes I found very powerful, and truthfully, everything in these chapters actually fit into the next one, if you understand what I'm trying to say. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and maybe you can understand what I'm talking about. So, chapter 12. Chapter 12, the Resurrectionist. Whoa, the Resurrectionist. So, chapter 12 talks about George Washington Cole, and now he wants to be a general. This chapter talks about how he often felt being buried by others, them being the newspapers, his own superiors, and how he always clung onto the idea of becoming general, having General George Washington Cole. Sounds like a very good name. He quotes the route he would rather take than bowing or scraping, rather, or in a way, kissing ass and bowing down to the higher ups. He quotes it right here, towards the bottom of page 1. I'm going to quote. He complains to his brother, I shall not be commanded by my juniors and inferiors much longer. He thought that his lack of a promotion could be traced to his unwillingness to scrape and bow. I am the equal to any man I know of, and not that be giving to begging and fawning. Merit was the honorable path. So he becomes general, but he becomes a general of all Black Brigade. In late July, him and his regiment transferred to James River, in a place called Deep Bottom. Now, Deep Bottom has a lot of horrors. What went down? The horrors can be traced in page 4, right over here, right here, when they begin talking about a newspaper. Thomas Morris Chester. He's the war's only black correspondent for a major newspaper. He spent much of his time around black soldiers in the army of James. Chester often wrote about things that he can't be silent about, since it's his own people who are suffering through it. So he quotes and tries to expose the wrongness and how African Americans are being treated. So he starts talking right here. Wow, I lost the page. That's crazy. Right here. During the project, Thomas Morris Chester, the war's only black correspondent for a major newspaper, spent much of his time around black soldiers in the Army of the James. Chester, who often wrote in a buoyant manner for the Philadelphia Press, could not remain silent about what he saw at Dutch Gap, the massive undertakings that opened up blacks to old abuses, the wrongs suffered by black soldiers and laborers in the Army of the James. He wrote, if ventilated, would expose a disgraced depth of depravity practiced by dishonest men in the name of the government. Now, we can tell, or I saw, that black soldiers who worked at the same area with some white soldiers who were allured with increased pay, right over here. Black soldiers toiled alongside legions of black laborers, some white soldiers who were allured with increased pay, and some rebel prisoners who dug to make Butler's vision into reality. The workers were confined within massive earthen walls as enemy shells exploded around them. For a short period, Butler trotted out of rebel prisoners to the fired upon grounds in order to retaliate for the reported use of captured black soldiers in rebel projects heavily shelled by Union batteries. Now, we can talk about who, in this chapter, also talk about Butler. Who is Butler? Well, Butler was a general who gained his spot through conniving ways, I would say, and lost it because of conniving ways. Or rather, the way he lost it was because of bad communications. But before that, the man who wrote the newspaper, he actually writes about Cole. He starts talking about him in his own way, and it's actually pretty interesting because he makes him out like a hero. Here we go. Page 6. Perhaps Chester actually heard it from Cole's own mouth. At the very least, the reporter spent time with the officers and soldiers who surrounded Cole. In his September report, he singled out Cole in a striking way. Grant had recently issued Circular Number 31, which was designed to encourage rebel soldiers to desert into Union lines. The circular promised deserters money, amnesty from possible charges of treason, and transportation home. Chester believed that Cole, more than anyone else, was able to lure away or lure over many rebels from the enemy's thinning picket line. He added that the gallant colonel is now suffering from the effects of a wound which he received some time ago. Chester claimed that Cole was destined to play a heroic role in the upcoming days or weeks, as soon as Cole is able to mount his favorite charger. It is generally supposed that he will open up a way for the desperate rebels to flee into Union lines. Though wounded, his courage will soon set him apart. There is no braver soldier in the service, Chester added. No one enjoys to a greater degree the respect of his soldiers or the affection of his men. These were the kinds of words. This is interesting right here. This one actually struck me and made me want to keep reading. That Cole longed to hear, but he hoped to hear it from white men in powerful circles. Now, I don't understand why he said that. Like, what was the reason? I'm not. Maybe I didn't read it well, but it didn't explain why he wrote him like that. Probably because he didn't like what was his name? The other general. Sorry. Most likely that's why. Butler. There we go, Butler. Most likely Butler. But you know, it was a pretty good thing to call him a hero. I think because he didn't really treat the black infantry as like he hated them and things like that. Unlike Butler and later on other generals would have treated them like, as one said, a parasite, parasites. But you know, so let's talk about Butler. This chapter always goes to Butler, and I find it interesting how you actually explained Butler. He was an important general to say, but he was a high-ranking general before he loses his rank and gets basically banished. And why it showed an interest for Cole, because Cole later on sends him messages, sends him mail and telling him, hey, do you mind saying, of my hero of my heroic acts. So therefore, that was really interesting. And he starts talking about it where Butler loses his position, how Butler and his like so this okay, so let's talk about Butler again. Let's talk about his blunders. Why did he blunder? While ending his military tenure in the army of James, just as he had begun it, Butler and his fellow officers suffered from an inexcusable lack of communication. Partly because Butler and the other commander, Admiral Porter, despised one another so much that they had to communicate through intermediates. Because of confusion or lust for glory, Butler embarked on his men ahead of the naval portion, including Porter, who was supposed to take the lead. After a series of miscues and several days waiting, Porter's fleet caught up with Butler and convinced him to move his ship further to the fort. And here we go, we talk about the chaos. So the importance of Butler in this part is that Cole sends him a mail, sends him a message. Once he loses his tumble from grace. He was top he was at the top of the hill and then they just dropped him because of what he's done. So this is where he starts talking about it. How he made a furious effort for promotion. Sends one of his junior officers who could lie like Judas to drum up support. How Cole and Butler had given a promotion to one captain. He started talking about how he learned about this. But he didn't really care about it, because they must have not liked each other. But he does send letters to Butler asking his commander to pass along accounts of his merits to the appropriate authorities. This is probably why you wrote it, because you wanted to give us an idea of this is why he sent it to him, because he might have still had connections. However, how he said it, Strand responded that he hadn't. After some investigation, Cole came to believe that Butler had actually sent the letter, and that for some reason it never made it to the secretary. He speculated that the letter had been suppressed by one of his rivals, the recently promoted General Ludlow, or General Farrar, in order to oust me. He sent a sharp letter of resignation to the Army of James headquarters, complaining that junior officers had jumped him again. They had been given command over the brigade and mostly raised with his own efforts. It would, I believe, be the violation of my self-respect to remain in my present position. He wrote about tendering his resignations. I know I can do better elsewhere, he concluded. The letter, though, was intercepted by Brigadier General Edward Wilde, a one-armed radical abolitionist, perhaps the fiercest and most vengeful anti-slavery man in federal uniform, jointly concerned about where Cole's vitriol was heading, and probably reluctant to see a committed anti-slavery officer quit the war. Wilde returned the letter to the outraged colonel with a word of warning. We warned that if it would lead to Cole's dismissal instead of honorable discharge. But this is a grievous error, warned Wilde, who was struggling to maintain his own reputation after having been repeatedly court-martialed and demoted by his superiors. Wilde warned Cole that if he were dismissed, he would learn from a few more months that the stigma of a dismissal can never be washed out by any amount of explanations. It gives food to all enemies, it travels faster and further than any of good deeds put together. So, this was really interesting, this chapter. Um, so let's go to the next chapter, chapter 13. Chapter 13 talks about mutiny and, from what I summarized, a little bit about disease. So, begins with the fall of Richmond. Claims that black troops were the first to enter Richmond. However, they would have been robbed of the honor, as said so on page 26, which is right here. Some claim that black troops were the first to enter Richmond, others denied it. Still others said that blacks have been the first, have not been robbed of the honor. Cole's surviving letter shed no light on the controversy, because neither he or his soldiers were near the contested glory. He had just missed his chance. So, we start talking about rumors and speculations. Rumors and accusations had it that black soldiers ran amok and fell in Richmond. There were some credible reports, even of rape, but most of it added to wild tales of white locals, seized by fury and paranoia. In order to defray tensions, commanders sent the black regiments at Richmond to places like the outskirts of Petersburg to guard the south side railroads. Others were dispersed among the James River to wait and anxiously wonder about their fate. The Richmond Whig reported that the real secret of the transfer of the black troops was that in occupied Richmond, white Union soldiers. This was crazy, Crow. This is crazy. This your own team. White Union soldiers could not bear to see black men in uniform sharing the symbolic triumph. It was a poorly kept secret. So, the rumors on page 26. We could see the Union soldiers, some at the top position, hated black soldiers from page 27 to 28. We can talk about post-Butler regime, how it did not bode well for the black soldiers or their families. This is what he says about him. Alright. Okay, so right here. Man, I think I lost my train of thought. Give me a second. Okay. So this is where he starts talking about his friends, his black men. This is Brigadier General William Birney, who was an abolitionist. So his wait, hold on, I missed my point. Give me a second. Okay. I lost my train of thought. Okay, there we go. Alright, page 28. Now this is about Ord Bristles at Butler's promises. Made enlistment to black recruits that the U.S. would clothe and shelter their families. False promises. He threatened that if he couldn't terminate the rations for black soldiers, children, and wives, he would gather into buildings and open a grand general washing establishment for the city, where clothing of anyone will be washed gratis, free. When Ord, the commanding officer of the largest contingency of black soldiers in the U.S. Army, looked upon the wives and children of soldiers and refugees in general, he saw parasites. A little hard work and confinement, he wrote, will soon induce them to find employment. So, this chapter also talks about the diseases that a lot of black soldiers, dealt with in the page of top 30, right here. The bodies of these Coral soldiers exhibited disturbing signs. Months and months of sluggish warfare along the outskirts of Richmond and Petersburg, of wet trenches and of poor rations, had taken its toll. The miserable conditions finally manifested themselves to the soldiers' limbs, skin, eyes, and teeth. Many of the sick soldiers, most of whom had never known, only ever known rural life, relieved themselves near the crowded huts and tents, and along the earthworks. Their cramped spaces became breeding grounds for diseases. One white witness said that the soldiers worked long hours on fatigue duty, only to climb into very dark, damp, and cold huts. As early as January 1865, a medical officer in the Army of James was alarmed by widespread illnesses. He condemned the recruiting process, accusing careless agents of ignoring disability and illness in order to fill draft quotas. General Edward Wild, who had been practiced medicine before the war, believed that a sudden change of the soldiers' diet caused a derangement of their bodies. As slaves, they had more regular, if meager, portions of fish, greens, cornmeal, and yams. The army replaced the slaves' portions with erratic and sometimes repulsive rations. Added to that, well noted, already unhealthy recruits sick from damp and cold conditions were often forbidden from building personal fires. Even if fires were permitted, wood was scarce. The troops concentrated around Richmond and Petersburg, for instance, had striped the land of wood for miles. One of the flare-ups between Dollard and his black soldiers began with tensions over firewood. So, this is a lot about how you see the hatred of some soldiers, white Union generals as well, towards black soldiers. You can see how one of the generals matched him, saying that in a way slavery was better because they had better food. They're not used to this life. They're not used to being soldiers. And even in the next part, where he started talking about his commands to the 25th Corps with a little firewood, a little energy. Lying listlessly in West clothes, Charles Francis Adams Sr. seemed to refer to this when he cautiously or caustically wrote to his father that a sick black soldier at once gives up and lies down to die, the personification of humanity reduced to wet rag. He cannot fight for life like a white man. Now then. This was a man who was in the Union side. And then Adam blamed it on their lack of will. And many regiment soldiers viewed the sickness of black soldiers in similar distorted ways. They gave self-fulfilling prognoses where sick black soldiers, who were supposedly more apt to succumb to disease, justified shady care with the withholding of costly medicine. The circular reasoning is that used by Adams held the cold and wet men were like cold and wet rags because of some mental weakness or some collapsing of the spirit. This justified neglect, which would in turn seemed to prove right to harsh judgments of surgeons. This was the thinking of black soldiers, healers, and commanders. Now, now this is interesting because it reminds me of some parts of movies where the slavers would tell people, "Oh, the African American is used to the heat. They're black because the sunlight doesn't do damage to them." And that's what I felt reading this, especially from the northern side, because these were Union people. These were people who were fighting for a cause, and some of them didn't have their heart into it, and some of them still had that same mentality. This is what I learned from this chapter, which is really interesting. So, for chapter 14, right? In chapter 14, the family, the inflammatory stimulus. So, the trauma of separation laid below the mutiny. Familiar love, traumatic memories brought co-soldiers to arms. Now, this is where we talk about the mentality of differences between a white person and an African American person in this time, in this war. African Americans were fighting not only for freedom, but they wanted to get back to their families. They wanted to reunite to the wife that was sold to different states, and they fought because, you know, they fought because of these reasons, and most were recruited because of these reasons as well. In page 50, we can see many of the soldiers had been recruited with the understanding, backed by Butler's promise and the face-to-face enticements of recruiters like Cole, that in exchange for taking up arms, the army would provide sustenance for their recent freed wives, aged parents, and children. Male refugees often saw themselves as architects of freedom for their kinfolk. They were frequently the first to run from bondage in the Tidewater region. When a runaway found some way to hire himself out behind the Union lines, he often risked his freedom by returning into the Confederacy to pry loose his loved ones from slavery's grips. Now, this is what Cole's troops were. Cole's troops found an immediate link between military service and family. More perhaps than refugee slaves from other parts of the South did. Many slaves from border states like Kentucky or Maryland saw joining the army as a road to personal freedom that promised little for family. The status of refugee slaves there had not been altered by the Emancipation Proclamation, and were no federally sanctioned contraband camps to which they could reliably and safely bring their families. In fact, border state soldiers from places like Missouri and Kentucky often risked putting their families in danger of violent retribution from enraged masters whose slaves Lincoln had promised not to free. Now, these are different things, especially the idea of Texas. Um, in the beginning, I didn't understand why people didn't want to go to Texas, but then I started thinking about it and read more into it, and it was pretty bad. Page 56 starts talking about why they didn't want to go back, the illnesses that have been received, and right here. Nearly 50 ships have been packed with troops, mules, artillery, and supplies for southeast Texas. Army reports painting images of thorough preparations. Yet there was a wholesale negligence in planning for the soldiers' most basic necessities. Food was scarce on the ships, and soldiers grew even sicker in the dark. Crowded and poorly ventilated berths between the decks, which had been hastily built by carpenters a week before. The previous undiagnosed cases of scurvy became a full-blown epidemic aboard the ship. Upon their arrival in Texas, enfeebled soldiers emerged from the ships to discover the bleak environs of Brazos Santiago, a small barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico at the southern tip of Texas. During the war, the island fort had only accommodated 4 regiments. Now, within weeks, some 35 regiments converged onto the region. Overwhelming available resources, each arriving ship brought about 50 to 100 men who needed urgent medical care. The post hospital, the only facility in the region, had only 80 beds. So, next page, our next paragraph was really what talked about African Americans, how the soldiers were. Within a week, 500 black soldiers were deathly ill. Men lay everywhere. Many sprawled out in the hot sands without shelter. In swampy heat, some of the soldiers slipped into a sort of listless, des- uh, despondent trance. Many of them with their remaining teeth nearly enclosed by bloody purple and black gums. Others suffered bloated limbs and that ooze serum. Men hobbled on the thighs and calves, hardened like stones, and half-fused ankle bones. Many bodies were covered with foul ulcers. So, there's a reason why a lot of soldiers, especially African Americans who didn't want to go to Texas unless they were promised the things that made them join the Union Army. Um, Misery, page 59. A surgeon writes about it. One surgeon wrote privately to his father that the desperate situation was damnable, and that he could not stand to see his men murdered by inches. The terse statement of veteran soldiers in the Second Colored Cavalry shed light on the origins of their suffering in Texas and their post-war disabilities. They called it bone scurvy, saltwater scurvy, and sometimes just referred to their sickness by the name of misery. Now, the next page, chapter 15. Chapter 15: The Saving the Union at Home. Now this is where you start talking about George Cole, him returning home, how at the end of the war, how he felt, what he went through, his job, his depression, seeing his wife get sexually assaulted, and how he was scarred through it. I don't think they knew what depression was. I don't think they knew all these things just yet, in my idea. But this was a really deep chapter for 15. So, George was one of many veterans who could not put their lives back together. He couldn't find a job. His curious demeanor, the way he held himself, might have had something to do with it. Friends and neighbors noticed that the general rarely laughed or struck up conversations. When he did talk, often maundered on about the war. To many who knew him, he was a repulsive shell of his former self. So, a few months after his return, he began repairing a house that Mary Cole had purchased while he was in Texas. In a sense, he was working for her now, raising a barn and fixing up the yard so she could turn a profit on the property. So, um, this chapter, one of the parts, the quotes that I found really interesting, was that he did have a conversation with people, but his conversation was kind of, in a way, it sounded like a suicidal joke. I'm not sure what. I think it was a suicidal thing. So this is where he starts talking about it. When summer began, he had no employment. After he calls the paper store with his comrade, Frank Garrett, where the two evidently discussed their common past and ambitions. When his war buddy inquired about George's increasing downheartedness, George confessed that he would never get over the difficulty he got in service, and that his wound had used him up so that he was no more good to himself or family. Once after Frank struck George on the leg, perhaps with an encouraging pat or after a joke, George warned him of his pistol wound, adding that he wished it had been higher up, so that he would now be asleep under the sod of Virginia. So, sounded pretty sad. Probably has PTSD. Um, you can see that he wasn't a bad guy from the previous chapters. Um, he had some hard comings. He saw the things. He most likely lived through them. Not lived through them, but he walked through those shoes as well. He was the general of African Americans who weren't treated right, and he saw the horrors they had to face, and he was there, you know. And even at the end of the war, he wasn't treated like a hero. So then you start talking about he got his first job, which was pretty cool. Short lived though. He gets paid. He never gets paid actually. And it starts in page 76 in July 1866. George caught a break when he was hired as an assistant superintendent at the Empire Wood Company. George oversaw correspondence in which he was expected to address them, concerned with customers, arrange payments, and sell windmills to local and distant clients. He also kept the books and paid the factory hands who labored in the second floor wood shop, as well as those who worked with iron by the boiler room in which the next was off the ground level. So, this is where we start talking about tight finances, right here. Perhaps the tight finances accounted why George did not receive full pay. The young company had to borrow against his earnings every month. According to the directors, George ran into trouble at his job when he began making wild and visionary bargains with clients, many from North Carolina, the very place where he spent much of the war destroying property, including flour mills. Company directors called his customers irresponsible. Perhaps the general took advantage of military connections and sold more windmills on credit to a few of his black soldiers. Whoever his customers were, the money owed for the windmills never came. January 1867, stockholders and directors voted to terminate his job, withholding nearly $3,000 to owe to him because it was argued George was responsible for the unpaid accounts. So he had a job, never got paid for it. It's pretty sad because as a veteran, he wasn't treated just right. He even told his brother Can't stand it, he wrote. He mused about writing a book about his war experiences, but complained that he couldn't concentrate enough in his home. He'd be more successful authoring a book in Babel or at a lunatic asylum, he joked. He needed a quiet office before, because every time he sat to begin something matter, some tug from family put him off track. So this chapter really talks about his downfall. It talks about his like not bad things, but the way he was treated, the way his mentality was. He most likely had PTSD. He was most likely depressed, and he just had a hard life after the war. And then later on, his wife gets sexually assaulted, which is just sad. Sadder. This man's life is like a downward spiral, coming from wishing to be a general to earning the rank to later on in chapter 16, his rank really not meaning anything because people just threw it out, threw him away. People just threw the rank of general around. So I'm gonna go to chapter 16, the last chapter that I read. Chapter 16 is called First as a Private. Cole obtained as burials in the Howard War. Wait, hold on. Okay, so here, crime and penance. First is private. This he starts talking about how Mary returned on the morning after the murder and lost her composure. The prisoner gently calmed her. Another correspondent wrote that there was no marked expression of feeling between the parties, hinting that their marriage lay in tatters. The same day, from the coffins of his cell, he began his search for legal counsel, interviewing at least two renowned attorneys. He also had his chance to tell a story to reporters and lookers on. He stood or sat in his cell and read the defense that he had just carefully crafted behind bars, or perhaps that he had written before the murder. I had a friend, L.H. Hiscock, the revelation began. I thought him the best friend in the world. I have a wife and two children. She is pure as snow, or was before he became acquainted with her in 1864. I was in the army, first as a private, at last as a major general. Choking back tears, sometimes crying bitterly, he went on to say that Hiscock had assaulted Mary when she was ill. She believed that she laid in what she feared was her deathbed, and called upon Hiscock to alter her will. She laid helpless, George wanting the world to know, when the attorney raised her up and forced his mouth on hers. She resisted and later forgave him after he begged for mercy, but he soon returned again and again under the guise of business, trying to draw her into his web, one time locking his forceful arms around her and disrobing her. Hiscock had recently tried and failed to have his way with her again when George was away in Washington, D.C., probably when he had broken down on the sofa in the Capitol building. Just hours before, as he walked to the jail, George said that Mary had been ravished, but now the general was clear. She never gave Hiscock all that he wanted, but over a series of encounters, the destroyer brought her acute shame and depression. When his crafty story came to the moment where he approached and killed Hiscock, George broke down and wept, not for Hiscock or the deed, but for poor, heartbroken Mary, who was, he said, flashed in his mind during the slaying. An image of his disgraced daughters rose up inside of him. He couldn't speak as he raised his gun. He wanted to say something to tell Hiscock the line that he had rehearsed in his head for leaving the country within 10 days. He couldn't utter a word of it. Something was in my throat. Now, this was interesting. He gets revenge on the man who sexually assaulted his wife. However, his marriage is laid in tatters because I believe he knows that he's going to be in jail. He knows he was probably going to stay there for life. And his wife is sad because, most likely he'll never see his daughters again. And, it could have been that gentleman like Southern appeal, how Southern gentleman is, but for a Northerner, that, he as a man felt disrespected. So, this is where he talks. It was one sentence from his weavy confession in particular that drew the attention of George Cole's enemies. It had nothing to do with sex or the question of when Mary would keep opening her door to a man who had tried to assault her several times. They instead made controversy out of the matter-of-fact summary of his war record. I was in the army first as a private and last as a major general. After reprinting the statement, the New York Times made sure to tell its readers that he had actually begun as a captain and then as brigadier general, the first being a few steps above private and the latter significant drop below major general. Within several days, the New York Tribune, one of a few papers that at first partially defended his actions, responded in defense of his words. After assuring its readers of George's record of honor and integrity, the paper doubled down and embellished George's original statement. He enlisted as a private early in the war, but was soon mustered into service of the United States as a captain. During the vicissitudes of 5 years, he rose to the position of major general, his promotion each time coming unexpectedly and entirely without solicitation of his part. When General Cole went into the army, he left a lucrative business, which in his absence was entirely broken up. So, this is where you start talking about the Syracuse Journal, whose editor George's friend believed was in league with Hiscock's chums, took issue with this claim. It reprinted this seemingly unremarkable sketch of George's character, warning readers that the murder's heroic army record and previous accomplishments should not color how Americans view the crime. This was a question of law and order, and Journal insisted not on military ranks or battlefield exploits, but then, as if it conceived the military sketch mattered dearly, over half of the article challenged these purported cardinal virtues. Cole did not enlist as a private. He did not leave a lucrative business to go into the army. He went out as a captain of COH in the 12th Regiment New York State Volunteers, NYS most likely, and was subsequently transferred to a cavalry regiment. He was brevetted a major general about the time he was mustered out of service. So, this is where they start talking about when he said his dream was to become general. Did he accomplish his dream? He became general of a black regiment, but I don't think they viewed him like that. George's enemies mobilized over these details because they knew what he was up to. His terse war summary of his life was a powerful code for character. He had started with nothing and secured his own honors he had made himself. So, this is where they all start talking about his position. And it said that a lot of people actually received the word of general. And right here, they start talking about it. Right here. George's lie that he began the Civil War as a private showed how badly he wanted to be seen as a self-made man like Lincoln. But if it was a fib, it was one that he must have believed he could get away with. Perhaps he thought he could tell a story because before in 1861 he had just been a common civilian in Syracuse. He probably believed he could exploit the confusion inherited in military titles, as soldiers' new rank and promotions were shot through intrigue, accident, and controversy. So, this is where it goes. As for the grade of Major General, which both Cole and Butler used to amplify their ascent from humble privates, only Ulysses Grant had ascended to a higher grade during the 4-Year War, when Lincoln appointed him to Lieutenant General, a full rank that only George Washington had held. On its face, George's claim was an audacious brag, but it was partly true for him and thousands of other men who came home referring to themselves as generals, and the many thousands more who called themselves colonels, majors, and captains. The murkiness originated from the confusion between regular and volunteer commanders. After Lincoln called for volunteer troops and formed volunteer units, throngs of regular officers took leave of the regular army and fanned out to command the sprawling volunteer army, which was in dire need of trained commanders. The volunteer army opened up commands and sudden promotions in rank, once out of reach for any of the most select professional soldiers. So, here. So, they were giving out these words of general, which was really this chapter is kind of confusing for me. I'm not sure why, but how the rank was given so many times. How right here in 109, generals were legions after the war. Congress awarded the rank, especially by brevet, many more times than military necessities demanded. By the war's end, the army had given over 3 times more brigadier generalship than common sense seemed to warrant. The Union Army awarded more than 2,500 generalships on paper, yet only 139 of them were non-brevet or actual major generals, and of these actual major generals, only 11 obtained the grade within the regular army. These 11 generals formed the war pantheon that Northerners associate with the pinnacle military power. Household names like Sheridan, McClellan, Sherman, Grant, Meade, and Hancock. So, Cole maybe goes to show how in the newspaper before, in the 2 chapters previous, they made him seem like a hero. And pretty interestingly enough, okay, so right here. The committee prepared a bill that would abolish brevet ranks except for soldiers who had acted heroically on the battlefield. It was sought to stop the growing problem at parades where brevet officers sported uniforms that accorded with their brevet rank, not their actual. Too many brevet officers, in other words, returned home and began dressing up in uniforms that were not permitted to wear in the field, making the brevet rank seem more indistinguishable from the true one. Prisoner Cole promotion were a confusing set of titles, many of them retroactively amplified or applied. An officer could hold as many as 4 grades at once. His full grade in the regular army, a different grade in volunteers, and the elevated brevet grade in both armies. If this had brought confusion with the camp during questionings of senior promotions, the lack of clarity meant that returning soldiers still had aspects of their military identity up for grabs. When a general penned his letter and stretched his military rank to its credible limits, he was merely pushing his fellow Yankees into the Hall of Mirrors created by the war and by American reverence, not worship, but the cult of self-made manhood. So, this chapter